Welcome to this edition of Pre-Internet Plane Spotting, brought to you by JetFlix. Hi everybody, my name is Henry Tenby. Welcome to this edition of Pre-Internet Plane Spotting. Some of you might be aware that I collect vintage Kodachrome color slides of airliners and aircraft taken in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And I acquire aircraft slide collections on an ongoing basis. And I recently picked up some very interesting slides that were taken in Los Angeles at LAX airport at the spotting location that's by the taxiway. I believe it's in the inside section by the old Flying Tigers hangar that you had to access from the Pacific Highway side of the airport by the beach. And at the time, the fence was at basically waist level, so you could just stand by the fence and take photos of all the aircraft that were taxiing to and from the terminal. And in this footage, I'm going to share with you, they are images that were taken 1967 of all the various aircraft that you would expect to see in Los Angeles at LAX during 1967. And of course, none of these aircraft are still operational. All the types have long since been retired, so it's interesting to look back on all these classic airliners. So I hope you enjoy what you're about to see. Our first photos are actually taken on the approach on the far west end of the field. These images were taken as the aircraft crossed the threshold, just as they come in over the beach at El Segundo and they cross over the Pacific Highway. So these photos were taken on a cloudy day in 1967, and they are representative of what you would see on such a day. And here we have a United Airlines Boeing 720, possibly inbound to LAX from Denver or Chicago. These were in revenue service starting in the early 60s, and they were retired in the fuel crisis of the early 1970s. This is an American Airlines Boeing 707, a 138B. You can tell by the notched forward leading edge from the number 2 and number 3 engines to the fuselage. It's notched. And these aircraft were in revenue service until the early 1980s, also delivered in the early 1960s. National Airlines took delivery of Boeing 727-35 series starting in the mid-1960s, and they operated on their routes throughout the United States. This Series 35 727 is on approach to LAX. National Airlines, of course, was taken over or merged with Pan Am in the late 1970s. And of course, many of the 727s then adopted Pan Am schemes in the 1980s under Pan Am ownership. And this is a National Airlines DC-8-21 series. National Airlines took delivery of their 21 Series DC-8s in the early 1960s. And in this photo, the aircraft is most likely operating a service from Miami, inbound from Miami to Los Angeles. The total production of the Series 20s was 34 aircraft, but an additional 21 Series 10 DC-8s were also converted to the Series 20 standards, which means a total of 55 DC-8 Series 20s were produced by the Douglas Airplane Company. National Airlines retired its short-body DC-8 fleet between the mid-1970s and the late 1970s, although the 727s and DC-10s remained in active service past the Pan Am merger into the 1980s. This is a TWA Boeing 707-131B. TWA had a huge fleet of Boeing 707s, including the short 120 series, which this is, and of course the longer fuselage 300 series. TWA retired the 707s in 1981-1982, and the fleet was flown to Kansas City, where they were placed in storage, and this was at the time that the Boeing 707s were replaced by fuel-efficient new Boeing 767 aircraft. During the 1960s, Pacific Airlines operated a fleet of F-27s and 727-100s on local service routes on the west coast of the United States between Washington State, Oregon, and California. Here we have a Pacific Airlines F-27 seen taxiing at LAX, possibly on a short-haul service from within the state. Pacific Airlines and their F-27s were quite frequent visitors and could easily be seen at the San Francisco International Airport and were regularly photographed from the observation deck there. In 1967, Air Canada was serving Los Angeles only from Toronto, and here we have an Air Canada DC-8 Series 42, obviously recently inbound from Toronto on her taxi to the terminal building. The DC-8, powered by Conway engines, was the DC-8 42, and TCA took delivery of the first aircraft in 1960. Total production of the Series 40 only amounted to 32 aircraft, and the only airlines to actually use the Conway-powered DC-8 40 series were Air Canada, Canadian Pacific, CP Air, and Italian carrier Alitalia. TWA was very active in Los Angeles, going back into the 1950s with their Connies, but here we have a TWA 727 Series 31. A total of 407 of the short-body 727-100 series were produced, and TWA's fleet of 727-31s remained active well into the 1980s. Continental Airlines was another of the active U.S. carriers at Los Angeles starting in the 1950s, but in the 1960s they used Boeing's, four-engine Boeing 707s and 720s, as pictured here, on their routes to other points in the continental United States and trans-Pacific over to Honolulu. Continental's Boeing 720-024B aircraft were actually quite rare. I mean, the entire 720 production was a very limited affair, with only 89 examples being produced starting in 1961. And here we have a United Airlines Douglas DC-6 taxiing at Los Angeles, 1967. United operated the DC-6 on passenger routes up until the late 1960s, with many of the routes being within the state of California. United Airlines first put the Douglas DC-6 into service in April of 1947, and the final production of the DC-6 ended in 1958, with the final United Airlines service happening about a decade after that. Many people could successfully argue that the most iconic airline and the most iconic aircraft of the 1960s had to be Pan American and their Boeing 707. Pan Am 707 Series 331, as pictured here, offered the finest in air travel during the early 1960s. The Pratt & Whitney JT4A turbojet-powered 707 proved to be an ideal candidate on the carrier's transatlantic run from New York to London and on to Paris. Pan Am began these routes in 1959 and was able to transport a maximum of 189 passengers in high-density 6-abreast cabin configuration. But the Pan Am 707s also spanned the globe. Pan Am operated an around-the-world service, including a Los Angeles to Honolulu run, which is most probably operated by the aircraft shown in this picture. The Douglas DC-8 Super 61 stretch was the jumbo jet of the 1960s before the advent of the 747. The aircraft was incredibly long. It had a length of 187 feet with a wingspan of 142 feet. The total wing area was 2,884 square feet. The very first DC-8 Super 61 flew on March the 14th, 1966, and introduced to service in 1967. It's most probable that this Douglas DC-8 61 of Delta was operating an inbound service to Los Angeles from the Delta base at Atlanta Hartsfield. And last but certainly not least would be this Aeronaves de Mexico Baby DC-9. Aeronaves was a regular operator into Los Angeles in the 1960s, and Mexican Airlines continued to serve Los Angeles with Baby 9s well into the 1990s. The DC-910 was a very efficient and safe aircraft, and most likely this aircraft was serving Los Angeles from Mexico City. As I explained at the beginning of the video, I collect old aircraft slides, and I'm always looking for slide collections. So if you have a collection of aircraft slides, especially from the 50s or 60s, I am a buyer. I'm interested in acquiring such collections, so please do get in contact with me. If you like this video, please click the thumbs up below. That would be awesome. Thank you very much. Also, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. I'd love to see that. I'd like to introduce myself. Hi there, my name is Henry Tenby. I am the creator of JetFlix TV, which is the new aviation superfan streaming service. The long play version of the video that you just watched streams on JetFlix TV, and there's other amazing classic airline videos that you might find interesting as well. If you'd like to try JetFlix TV, I have a couple of suggestions for you. In the upper right-hand corner is a pop-out where you can click and you can get the first 30 days free, full access to JetFlix TV, and then it's only $5.99 a month, and I hope that you'll check it out. There's another option as well that's now in the pop-out in the upper right-hand corner where you can save money by subscribing for 6 months or 1 year. So it might be something you might like to check out. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you on the next show.